Well, Jim, in news that is breaking right now as we are recording, it has come out, The Hollywood Reporter, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson will be taking on his most dramatic role to date in a new A24 project, that's the company who did the Von Erich movie, from one half of the Uncut Gems team, Benny Safdie. Well, the main point here, The Rock's going to be playing Mark Kerr in a movie take on the documentary The Smashing Machine. Any thoughts on this?
Okay.
And I'm not sure if you were ever around Mark Kerr at all, or...
Well, that's what it took me a second, and I realized a former mixed martial arts fighter, and that was his nickname, The Smashing Machine, correct?
That's right.
I didn't know where in the world you were going with that, so it took me a second. But no, I never met the guy, but I know briefly of his reputation. And so now The Rock is going to be a mixed martial artist. Well, he looks fucking great for it, but what is the story, the approach to the story they're going to take here? What did Mark Kerr do that's movie worthy?
Mark Kerr was a fantastic fighter who did bare knuckle shit and was dominant, and he quickly went to the top of the UFC, and then he quickly walked out, and he went and did other things, and he burned out pretty quickly. He had a major drug problem. When we did Yama Pit Fighting, he was a last-minute addition to that show. I forget, who did he replace? He was a last-minute replacement on that show, and at the time, he was shot already. I think he replaced Don Fry. It's an interesting role for Dwayne Johnson to play, because Dwayne Johnson's much older than Mark Kerr was at his peak. Mark Kerr was someone who didn't really look like Dwayne Johnson.
But also, Dwayne Johnson looks goddamn better now than Mark Kerr did look at his peak, didn't he?
Well, it depends on, Mark Kerr at his peak was pretty jacked, but it's an interesting role.
But I mean, just a better looking man.
I get worried. That last DC movie was his passion project, and that almost killed the studio, didn't it? So I would hate to be the person to have to tell The Rock that, maybe you're not the best person to play this role. But we'll see. We'll see how it works out. But you were never around Mark Kerr. That's the...
Never met him, no. I'm sure he probably stretched a few friends of mine, but I've never met him.
How big was the move, if any, internal to get more... Like, you had Ken Shamrock. Dan Severn ended up coming in very different than Ken Shamrock. Was it ever a move to get other UFC early stars?
No. Again, Vince had no fucking idea. Shamrock was saved because he actually had trained in pro wrestling and had worked as Vince Torelli in the early 90s in the Carolinas. I had worked with him on a spot show Greg Price promoted. Actually worked with him in a battle royal, me and Stan beating up fucking the future Ken Shamrock. But Vince he didn't understand, he didn't get, he didn't want to get, was not interested in the UFC, mixed martial arts, whatever. That's why unfortunately, the whole thing when Dan Severn came in, it didn't work out because Vince McMahon didn't have any idea who any of these people were. And you couldn't tell him the import of their rivalry on pay-per-view for the UFC, what that had been. And you had, again, Shitstain, who was more interested in goddamn clowns and ponies and oddities than in promoting Severn and Shamrock. And there was no, except by Shane McMahon, as, everybody's talked about. He wanted to buy the fucking UFC at one point. But there was nobody that could... Bruce knew who everybody was, but he wasn't going to argue with Vince McMahon about it. Jim Ross knew who everybody was, but he couldn't argue with... He could argue with Vince, but he saw it was pointless. And Vince didn't want to do real sports crossovers. He wanted to have stars from real sports come over and goddamn do hoo-ha. So we couldn't get any more UFC guys or MMA guys or people from that world because Vince didn't see it.